The air was thick with decay as Nate, Jess, and Liam made their way through the overgrown entrance of Hollow Creek Zoo. It had been shut down for nearly 2 decades, left to rot after a series of mysterious deaths. For urban explorers like them, it was the ultimate prize. An abandoned zoo, forgotten by the world, waiting to be uncovered. The rusted gate groaned as Jess forced it open, sending a flock of startled crows into the sky. Their caws echoed through the silent, empty zoo, a warning that none of them heeded. "This place is incredible," Nate whispered, his voice filled with awe as they stepped inside. Weeds and vines had overtaken the paths, cracking the concrete beneath their feet. Empty cages lined the walkways, their bars twisted and broken, remnants of a time when the zoo housed creatures from all corners of the earth. Liam's camera was already recording, capturing every detail. "Check this out," he said, pointing to a faded sign that read Reptile House. The arrow pointed to a darkened building in the distance, its windows shattered and covered in grime. "Let's start there," Jess suggested, always eager for the creepiest spots. Nate agreed, and the trio moved toward the building, the crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots, the only sound in the eerie silence. Inside, the air was damp and cool, a stark contrast to the summer heat outside. The reptile enclosures, once home to snakes and lizards, were now empty, save for the occasional skeleton. Nate shivered, though the air wasn't cold enough for that. It was something else, something that felt wrong. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked suddenly, her eyes wide as she turned to look at them. They froze, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the drip of water from a leaky pipe. Then they heard it, a low, mournful howl, distant but unmistakable. "Wolves?" Liam asked, frowning. "No way there's anything still alive in here." "Maybe it's just the wind," Nate suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. The howl sounded too real, too alive. "Let's keep moving," Jess urged, her bravado slipping. "This place is huge. We should cover as much ground as we can before it gets dark." They left the reptile house and ventured deeper into the zoo, passing by the skeletal remains of the aviary, the empty monkey cages, and the overgrown petting zoo. Everywhere they went, that feeling of wrongness followed them, growing stronger with each step. As they approached the big cat enclosure, a chill ran down Nate's spine. The metal bars were bent outward as if something had forced its way out. The scent of decay was stronger here, almost overwhelming. Liam hesitated, lowering his camera. "This is weird," he muttered. "This whole place is like a graveyard." "A graveyard where the dead don't rest," Jess added, her voice barely above a whisper. She was staring at the enclosure, eyes wide with fear. Inside, shadows seemed to move, though there was nothing there. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the zoo, the sound of something heavy falling. They all jumped, hearts racing. "What the hell was that?" Nate gasped, looking around frantically. "It came from the aquarium," Liam said, pointing to the building ahead. Its roof partially caved in. Without waiting for a response, he started toward it, the others following reluctantly. The aquarium was a mess of shattered glass and stagnant water, the tanks long since emptied of life. The air was thick with the stench of rot and something else, something metallic, like blood. Liam moved forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Be careful," Jess warned, but he didn't listen. He was too focused on getting the perfect shot, capturing the decay of this forgotten place. Then they saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like a zookeeper's uniform. The brim of its hat cast a shadow over its face, hiding its features. "Who's there?" Nate called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there watching. Jess grabbed Nate's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to get out of here," she whispered urgently, fear finally breaking through her bravado. But before they could move, the figure stepped forward. Its footsteps echoed through the empty aquarium, slow and deliberate. As it moved closer, they could see its face, or what was left of it. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. It opened its mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a low guttural growl that reverberated through their bones. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the figure vanished. Liam swore under his breath, his hand shaking as he pointed his camera toward where it had been. "Did you see that?" "Let's go." "Now," Jess said, tugging at Nate's arm. But before they could take another step, the aquarium door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. Nate ran to the door, pulling at it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked." "No, it's not," Liam shouted, joining him. But even with both of them pulling, the door remained sealed shut, as if held by an invisible force. Jess backed away, her eyes darting around the darkened room. "We're not alone," she whispered. And for the first time, Nate heard real fear in her voice. The growling grew louder, surrounding them, coming from all directions. The tanks began to rattle, the glass vibrating as if something inside was trying to break free. Liam's camera flickered, the screen showing static before cutting out completely. Then the tanks shattered one by one, releasing torrents of murky water and the decayed remains of sea creatures that should have long since rotted away. The water swirled around their feet, rising quickly as more tanks broke, the glass shards cutting into their skin. Nate felt something brush against his leg, something cold and slimy. He looked down, but there was nothing there, just the dark churning water. But he knew better. Something was in there with them, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Up there!" Jess screamed, pointing to a metal ladder leading to a hatch in the ceiling. They scrambled up the ladder, slipping on the wet rungs, the water rising rapidly beneath them. Nate was the last to reach the top, his hands shaking as he pushed open the hatch and pulled himself through. They emerged onto the roof of the aquarium, gasping for breath, but there was no relief. The sky above was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The zoo stretched out before them, a labyrinth of darkness and decay. "We need to find another way out," Liam said, his voice trembling. Nate nodded, trying to steady his breathing. But as they looked around, they realized something terrifying. The zoo had changed. The paths they had walked were gone, replaced by new ones that twisted and turned, leading deeper into the zoo instead of out. "It's like the place is alive," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that had picked up, howling through the empty zoo. And then they heard it again, the growl, but this time it was different, louder, closer. The ghostly zookeeper was back, and he wasn't alone. In the shadows, they could see shapes moving, large, hulking figures, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The animals of Hollow Creek, or what was left of them, had returned. Their bodies were twisted and decayed, yet they moved with a terrifying purpose, driven by the same vengeful spirit that had trapped them here. "We have to keep moving," Nate urged, but it was too late. The first of the creatures lunged at them, a massive bear with patches of fur missing, its skin hanging from its bones. Jess screamed as it swiped at her, knocking her to the ground. Liam grabbed her, pulling her to her feet, but the bear wasn't alone. More creatures emerged from the darkness. A lion, a wolf, even a crocodile, all in various states of decay, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. They ran, darting between enclosures, the ghostly animals hot on their heels. The zoo was a maze, and no matter which way they turned, the paths led them deeper into the nightmare. The growl of the zookeeper echoed around them, urging the animals on. Liam was the first to fall, the crocodile's jaws snapping around his leg and dragging him down. His screams were cut short as the other animals descended upon him, tearing him apart in a frenzy of teeth and claws. Nate and Jess kept running, their lungs burning, but they knew it was only a matter of time. The zoo wouldn't let them leave. They could feel it, the invisible force that twisted the paths and closed off every exit, keeping them trapped. Finally, they reached the heart of the zoo, the zookeeper's house. It was an old, dilapidated building, its windows broken, and the door hanging off its hinges. Without thinking, they ran inside, slamming the door behind them. But the house offered no sanctuary. The air inside was thick with the smell of blood and rot, and in the dim light, they could see the walls lined with cages, small, rusted, and covered in dried blood. Inside each cage were the remains of animals, their bones twisted into unnatural shapes, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch the intruders. The floor was littered with old tools, some of them stained dark with blood, others bent and broken from years of misuse. Nate and Jess moved cautiously through the room, their every step echoing in the oppressive silence. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming now, a palpable force that made it hard to breathe. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on them, pressing down with the weight of the zoo's dark history. In the corner of the room, an old desk sat covered in dust, a single flickering candle the only source of light. Behind it, the ghostly zookeeper stood, his back to them, his head bowed as if in prayer. His hat obscured his face, but they could see his hands, bony and skeletal, clutching the edge of the desk with knuckles that had long since lost their flesh. Jess grabbed Nate's arm, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here. There has to be another way out." Nate nodded, though he wasn't sure where they could go. The door behind them was no longer an option. The growls of the undead animals were growing louder, closer. They were running out of time. As they turned to search for another exit, the zookeeper moved. His head slowly lifted, revealing a face that was little more than a skull. The skin stretched so tightly over the bones that it seemed ready to tear. His eyes were hollow pits, glowing with the same unnatural light as the animals outside. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to echo through the room. "This place is not for the living." Nate and Jess backed away, fear gripping them as the zookeeper began to move toward them, his steps slow but deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. "Please," Jess begged. "We didn't mean any harm. We'll leave, we swear." But the zookeeper only shook his head, a twisted smile spreading across his decayed face. "There is no leaving. You belong to the zoo now, just like the others." Nate's heart raced as he frantically looked for a way out. His eyes landed on a small, narrow door at the back of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. Without thinking, he grabbed Jess's hand and pulled her toward it. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the zoo. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it the stench of death. But there was no time to hesitate. The zookeeper was right behind them, his bony fingers reaching out just inches away. They plunged down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The darkness was nearly complete, the only light coming from the faint glow of the zookeeper's eyes above them. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling downward into the earth, the air growing colder with each step. Finally, they reached the bottom, stumbling into a large underground chamber. The walls were lined with more cages, but these were filled, not with the remains of animals, but with the skeletons of people. Urban explorers like them, who had ventured too far and paid the ultimate price. Their bones were twisted and broken, their hands still clutching the bars as if they had died trying to escape. Jess gasped, horror flooding her as she realized what had happened to them. "Oh my God, Nate. We're not the first." Nate felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. "We have to keep moving. There has to be a way out of here." But as they turned to search for an exit, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The walls of the chamber creaked and groaned, and from the darkness, the ghostly animals began to emerge. Bears, wolves, lions, all in various states of decay, their eyes glowing with that eerie light. They were surrounded. Nate backed up against the wall, pulling Jess close. "We're trapped." Jess shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, we can't die here." The zookeeper's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and merciless. "You should never have come here. Now you will become part of Hollow Creek, just like all the others." The animals closed in, their growls growing louder, more feral. Nate and Jess pressed themselves against the wall, trying to make themselves as small as possible, but it was no use. The undead creatures were upon them, their jaws snapping, their claws reaching out. And then, just as the first of the creatures lunged, Jess screamed. A scream so loud, so piercing, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the zoo. The animals recoiled, momentarily stunned by the sound. Nate stared at her in shock, realizing that Jess wasn't just screaming. She was fighting back with the only weapon she had left, sheer will. The zookeeper snarled, his ghostly form flickering as he tried to regain control. But Jess's scream grew louder, more powerful, reverberating through the chamber. The walls began to crack, the ceiling above them groaning under the strain. "Keep going, Jess," Nate shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." Jess's scream became a roar, a primal sound that drowned out everything else. The animals howled in pain, their ghostly forms flickering and fading as the very air around them seemed to crackle with energy. The zookeeper staggered back, his skeletal hands clutching his head as he tried to resist the force of Jess's scream. And then, with a deafening crash, the ceiling gave way. The ground beneath their feet shook violently as the chamber collapsed, sending dust and debris raining down. Nate grabbed Jess and pulled her toward the only opening he could see, a narrow tunnel that had appeared in the chaos. They ran, the walls crumbling around them, the ground shaking with the force of the collapsing zoo. Behind them, they could hear the enraged roars of the zookeeper and his undead animals, but they didn't dare look back. Their only focus was on the light at the end of the tunnel, the hope that it led to freedom. Finally, they burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. The night sky was clear above them, the moon casting a pale light on the ruins of Hollow Creek Zoo. Behind them, the entrance to the tunnel caved in, sealing the horrors of the zoo inside forever. Nate and Jess lay there for a long moment, too exhausted to move. They had made it out, but the nightmare of Hollow Creek would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they finally got to their feet and began to walk away from the ruins, Nate glanced back one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching them with glowing eyes. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the memory of the horror they had faced. "Let's go home," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. Nate nodded, wrapping an arm around her as they walked away, the cold wind carrying with it the distant echoes of a long-dead zoo. But as they disappeared into the night, a low growl rumbled through the ruins of Hollow Creek, a reminder that some things should never be disturbed, and that those who do may never truly escape.